thought I would begin with a memory, and you will see why momentarily, why this memory sort of, or how it plays into the totality of this story about my love of Howard Thurman. So my first semester of Vanderbilt Divinity School, I took the course on Black religious leadership from Forrest Harris. And the requirements for that course, one of the requirements for the course, was to choose from amongst a list of about 30 people. Choose one person for whom you were going to do a research paper and also stand and give an oral presentation in class. And when we were presented with the list, there were a couple of people that jumped out immediately. And I thought, well, I'm going to do either one or the other person. But I just thought, well, let me ask the professor. Let me consult with Dr. Harris after class and see if he has any insight before I make my final decision. And so right after class that day, I stopped him in the hallway, and I said, well, Dr. Harris, I'm thinking about a couple of people, but before I give you those names, I'd like to know what you think. Who do you think I should choose from this list? And it was a little bit like, the game that we play where you ask a person, you say to the person, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 10. And so I was thinking of that number, that person between 1 and 30, thinking that he was going to just confirm my choice and I would be happy and go off into the library and do my studies. But without hesitation, Dr. Harris sort of, as summoning me to some grand scheme, said Howard Thurman. And I thought, Howard Thurman? Because at the time, I hadn't heard of Howard Thurman. I didn't know who that was. I was thinking Ella Baker, someone else besides Howard Thurman. But I think assessing my hesitation, or at least my maybe trepidation about his choice, he followed up with, well, get his autobiography with Head and Heart. Read it, and then let me know what you think. And so you can probably intuit the rest of the story. I read with Head and Heart, and I read really the first few chapters without even realizing I was reading, if you've ever had that experience. And it just really changed me. And then I thought, well, that is a good decision. Good job. Okay. And that's really when people ask me to make a recommendation on the first book that they should read out of the 22 he's written, I always suggest reading with Head and Heart first, because it is such, it's compelling writing. And to be as transparent as he is about his life and about his own experiences with the church, some of them very difficult. It's a great read and a great place to start. So for our conversation today, there's so many different places to begin, but I thought that I would start with the autobiographical because I'm not certain where folks are in the room and how much we know about Howard Thurman. And so the autobiographical is, it's just a good place to start. So there we go. Oh, and this was one of those quotes from the book with Head and Heart that really captured me. Nightfall was meaningful to my childhood, for the night was for me more than a companion. It was a presence in articulate climate. And from there, I was sold. But Daytona Beach, or Daytona, Florida. So a lot of us know that he was born there. Some scholars note that he was born in 1889, some 1900, give or take a year. we know it's at the turn of the century. He was introduced to the idea of slavery there by his grandmother. She had a strong sense of, bless you, she had a strong sense of the ways in which Christianity could be used both to support slavery and also to support a liberative agenda. His grandmother is actually a vital link between his growing sense of denominational orthodoxy on the one hand and experimentation in religion tied to a pre-institutionalized religion practiced in Africa. So his grandmother is, again, she's this link between slave religion, slave thought, early practices of religious practices of Christianity, and then when she moves to Daytona and when she's freed, they become members of Mother Bethel Baptist Church, and so there's this, and it's evident in his story. There's this conversation really between the two, between slave religion, early practices of religion in Africa, or Africanized Christianity, and this institutional church, the Institutional Baptist Church. It's an idea really that Al Raboteau, who is, excuse me, he's an expert on slave religion. He clarifies the point well that it's the religious experience of the slaves which was by no means fully contained in the visible structures of the institutional church. And I emphasize this point because when we see Thurman departing a little bit later from what we would recognize as institutional Christianity, we can really trace some of his ideas and some of that influence to his grandmother and what she teaches him about how to read the Bible, what she's teaching him about practices in general. Okay, we lost our PowerPoint. That's okay. And so from Daytona, he attends high school in Jacksonville, Florida, simply because there is no black high school in Daytona. And he attends Florida Baptist Academy, and then from Florida Baptist Academy goes to college at Morehouse. And if we're thinking of dates, think of, this is 1919. He's packed up, left home, traveled to Morehouse. He's attending Morehouse and deciding to major in economics, believe it or not, which I think is just an interesting fact about him. His major advisor was Lorimer Milton, who was then the president of Citizens Bank and Trust Company of Atlanta. And basically, Professor Milton guides him through this major, guides him through his major of economics. We also know that he comes across several other historical figures that we now have some identity with. President John Hope, who was the president of Morehouse and also a historian. Dean Samuel Howard Archer, new faculty members, Benjamin Elijah Mays, E. Franklin Frazier, the eminent sociologist. All of these men are really shaping Thurman at this early period in his life. He's also licensed to preach while he's there at Morehouse. And learns how to speak extemporaneously. He joins the debate team. He teaches and preaches in churches around Atlanta. He's actively engaged in not only his studies, but in the community around which Morehouse is centered. And then he gets an opportunity to study the summer of his sophomore year at Columbia University. Unfortunately, if you know a little bit about Morehouse and the history of Morehouse, Morehouse is one of those land grant institutions founded by the American Missionary Society. And so for whatever reason, probably reasons attached to what a philosophical critique of race would give students during that period. You don't see very many institutions, HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, particularly Morehouse in this instance, offering courses in philosophy. Okay, Elijah Mays is teaching ethics and courses like that, but he actually was Benjamin Mays who suggests to Thurman that he should study philosophy at Columbia, and he does so during the summer of his sophomore year. And so in some ways, that summer in Columbia is also a beginning. There are many other beginnings. After that program, after he graduates from Morehouse, he matriculates in the Divinity program at Rochester Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York. There he's introduced to the theology of Walter Rauschenbusch. He's ordained for ministry into the Baptist Church. He marries right after graduation. He and his first wife, Kate Kelly, they moved to Oberlin to assume the pastorate of Mount Zion Baptist Church. He also gets another opportunity to spend a semester of study under the Quaker mystic Rufus Jones at Haverford College. And there we see is his first formal study of mysticism with Rufus Jones. And in fact, that, of course, impacts his work tremendously. And we'll say more about that later. But after his study there at Haverford, he actually leaves Mount Zion and returns to Morehouse and Spelman. And he teaches there. He has a teaching and advising position there. He also serves as dean of the chapel. His first wife passes. He marries. It's remarkable, but he soon after she passes meets and marries a woman that we tend to understand or know as his wife. We associate Sue Bailey Thurman with Howard Thurman. She's more known than Kate Kelly. And they move to Howard University after that. He assumes a professorate in Christian theology and becomes the dean of Rankin Chapel. Okay. In 1935, he and his wife, Sue Bailey, along with some other folks, travel to India. They go on what he refers to as a pilgrimage of friendship. It's a trip that is sponsored by the YMCA. They travel to India, Ceylon, and Burma. And we know from that particular trip and those travels that he has conversation with Gandhi. He meets Gandhi. They sit. There's actually a book that's just been recently published just about this trip to India. And then besides the conversation with Gandhi, we know about this experience that he has, a mystical experience, and it's one of a few that are noted in the autobiography, but a mystical experience at Khyber Pass, a mountain range that he has. It's so beautifully explained in the autobiography. They have to set out. He and his entourage have to set out very early in the morning to get to the peak of the range, and they set out so early because they're just there because they want to see the sunrise. But he has an experience there, and we know that it concretizes his desire for religious fellowship across boundaries. And so when he returns to the States, he is convinced that he is being called to create a religious fellowship, particularly across racial boundaries. It just so happens that he receives a letter from a gentleman in San Francisco who we now know as Dr. Fisk. And this pastor, Dr. Fisk, is actually requesting Thurman to send one of his students there to the church that he's pastoring because he is seeking, he wants a co-pastor. And so Thurman reads the letter, and rather than pass it on to his students or to someone there at Howard University, it compels him. And he writes to Dr. Fisk himself and says, I think I'd like to come. And that's the beginning of a relationship and a bit of history making, because we know that Dr. Fisk and Howard Thurman were two folks who sort of had similar interest in developing a fellowship that was intentional about crossing racial boundaries. Later, we know that this fellowship crosses even religious boundaries, and it becomes one of those things that history smiles upon. The church still exists. I've been to it. We were there maybe 3 years ago. And anyway, the church is called the Fellowship Church of All Peoples, which he co-founds in 1944. And then, of course, we understand that after about a 10-year period there, he moves or is invited to go back east, goes back to Boston, assumes the deanship of Marsh Chapel at Boston University. He retires from Boston University, and that, too, is a kind of beginning for Thurman. Because after his retirement, his life is really consumed with a great amount of travel, the establishment of the Howard Thurman Educational Trust, which he uses to write newsletters, to award scholarships, to catalog his speeches and essays, and to offer more insight about his own published works. Okay, so there's this, that's sort of a drive-by timeline of his life, but I think it gives us a sense of, anyway, this coming-of-age story for an African-American man at the turn of the 20th century. It's just an amazing story. But he's caught between two worlds, and I think that, again, that's one of the things that Thurman wrestles with. He's caught between an ex-slave world and the free world. He's caught between the world of the North and the South, literate and oral cultures, institutionalized religion, syncretic spirituality, Gandhi's India, and the Jim Crow South. So he's a guy that's integrating all these different experiences, that is reading. He's teaching, actually, philosophy of religion, both at Howard and at Boston. He's a historian of religion of sorts, and really trying to understand, really, the idea, the gem or the germ of the idea of religion itself. Okay? And so anyway, but the focus of this breakfast, right? His life is so compelling. I get excited about his life. But the focus of the breakfast is stillness, as a vital component of Thurman's mysticism, but related and relevant to activism. Thurman focuses on religious experience more than the academic black theology of the 60s, of the late 1960s and 70s. He is a precursor to James Cone, but while Cone notes the importance of black experience, Cone does not emphasize black religious experience in the same way. In an essay Luther Smith publishes in 1980 entitled Black Theology and Religious Experience, he takes Cone to task for not developing the concept of religious experience more. He writes, and I quote, "The nature and meaning of religious experience cannot be assumed. The discipline of Christian spirituality cannot be ignored. If black theology is to inform the liberation of black people, employing the full testimony of Christian faith, more writing and discourse will have to interpret the significance of religious experience and spiritual development to liberation. Okay, so there we see one of the early scholars of Howard Thurman really pushing someone like James Cone, who's writing in 1968, God of the Oppressed, and saying, you have done well, but what you didn't emphasize was the individual religious experience of African American folk. If you know anything about Cone, Cone does consider the collective experiences of African American people, and certainly emphasizes something of a systematic theology. He is in conversation with Tillich and others, but Smith is right on this point. He does not emphasize the relationship of religious experience to Black theology. And so Smith is suggesting that Cone takes for granted the collective religious experience of Black people as primarily an institutional phenomena witnessed in and experienced through the Black church. But in passages throughout Thurman's books, and I'm going to note a few, like Meditations of the Heart, Jesus and the Disinherited, The Luminous Darkness, The Creative Encounter, For the Inward Journey, Thurman is thinking and writing about prayer, centering. He sometimes refers to it as stillness, as you know, the lull even, or the pause. Okay. I note here that someone posted on Facebook rather recently that Thurman talked so slowly and deliberately that most of the time of the interview that this person was watching, that the most of the time, which was it was an hour-long interview, it could have been actually reduced to about 15 minutes because he was so deliberate, but for good reason, I think, for good reason. But what of this concept of stillness? What is its purpose? How does it factor in Thurman's notion of mysticism? Is stillness practiced by the mystic for reasons inherent to the notion of mysticism? What does mysticism provide the mystic? How is mysticism relevant to social action? These are some of the questions that we come with today. And in Thurman's essay, Mysticism and Social Action, we find some of the answers. Thurman writes, what is it then that the mystic claims that he experiences? Remember, this is not inclusive language, forgive me. He says, what is it then that the mystic claims that he experiences? For him, it's not merely emotional, though the feeling tone is deep and pervasive. To the mystic, what he experiences is not merely a general truth or a truth in general, but rather a profound certainty that he is caught up in a vital experience of truth itself. A vital experience of truth itself. Now there's some sense in the scholarship of noting how religious experience is mediated, and this is sort of an aside. When we talk about mysticism, or when we talk about the mystics, of course, we refer to them as Sufi mystics, right? Christian mystics, Jewish mystics, etc. There's a sense that mystical experience is mediated through the particularities of whatever system of thought one is familiar. There's also the notion that mystical experience is mediated through the particulars of the mystic's personhood. The demographics that the senses would be happy to have, person's race, person's gender and sexuality, sexual orientation. The mystics use the trappings of the faith to describe the mystical experience. The symbolism of the faith is there in the mystical experience. But the mystics use the trappings of personhood to talk about the mystical experience as well. We understand this all too well when we remember that Thurman is an African American male. No wonder his mystical experiences remind remind him, especially at this point in time in history, this historical context, no wonder that these mystical experiences remind him of his intrinsic worthfulness. And that's a phrase he uses. And no wonder that his experiences affirm the integrity of all humanity. His notion of mysticism is mediated through his body. And it is the truth yielding in mystical experience which enables a person to resist that which threatens the integrity of human experience. Alton Pollard has written extensively on the relationship between mysticism and activism. So let me just stop right here for a second. So on the one hand, what we see Thurman doing is, or saying, is when he has a mystical experience, one of the things that comes out of that experience is this truth in general, okay? But we hold that in tension with the fact that mystical experience is mediated through the particulars of the mystic. So for me, what I sense is Thurman saying, as a mystic, you know, these are my experiences, but ultimately what the experience yield is a common core understanding of what it means to be human. And we see that. I mean, there's, you know, that's from we see him explaining this more in the phrase common ground, for instance, or the notion of common ground, that despite religious differences, despite perhaps demographic differences, that what lies within a person is a commonness. What lies within a religion is a common core that we all share. And then the way this relates to activism, the way mysticism relates to activism, I think it would be helpful to use Alton Pollard, who is another Thurman scholar, to really underscore the point. He says that mystic activism, therefore, is a practice orientation to the world, which relies but in part, albeit considerable part, on the political and intellectual arguments and dictates of society. The more demanding motive is located in the obligation engendered by spiritual experience. So, again, what we see is Pollard really explaining that that activism is an organic response to the religious experience, an internal response to the religious experience. Activist, in this sense, the mystic activist is called forth to action from the experience that he or she has with God. Thurman recalls this memory to get again at really a couple of the aspects that I'm trying to deal with now. He recalls that memory when he was a seminary student at Rochester, and he was in the city and returning to the seminary late one night. He had been walking for some time before he noticed the continuous sound of what seemed to be rushing water. He's walking, suddenly notices the sound of rushing water. It had been there all along, but he became suddenly aware of it. It was late, traffic was almost non-existent, and he writes, when the surface noises had stopped, that is when the sound came through. When the surface noises stopped, then the sound came through. And Thurman says this is analogous then to the mystic's witness of God within, whose presence may not become manifest until the traffic of the surface of life is somehow stilled. This is what is meant by the experience of centering down. And I'm going to read a little bit from that meditation of his. William James, right, who also is writing on mysticism, confirms this understanding Thurman has. And he says, the simplest rudiment of mystical experience would seem to be that deepened sense of the significance of a maxim or formula which occasionally sweeps over one. I've heard that said all my life, we exclaim, but I never realized its full meaning until now. You know how that happens. You know, you've heard something all your life and then suddenly someone says it and then it sticks. He quotes Luther. He says, "When a fellow monk," said Luther, "one day repeated the words of the creed, 'I believe in the forgiveness of sins,' I saw the scripture in an entirely new light, and straightway I felt as if I were born anew. It was as if I had found the door of paradise thrown wide open." And that's from the Variety of Religious Experience. So Thurman corroborates the particularities of religious experience, but he also notes a common element, a core element to all religious experience, and that is its generalizability. What he effectively refers to, again, as common ground. It's in these places where Thurman seems, which we can't get into this today, but it's in these places in which Thurman seems more influenced by American pragmatism than he cares to admit. I hear in Thurman something that I read in John Dewey. John Dewey similarly says that whatever introduces genuine perspective is religious. Again, that might be too ambiguous for some, but it's a pragmatic core that I think is it's evident in Thurman. Thurman is often problematic to some because of these attempts to get past dogma and creed in ways that disrupt a Christian understanding, because for him religion is so universalizing. But it is the universalizing aspect of the experience of mysticism that grounds Thurman's vision for common worship and common fellowship. Okay, and we'll stop right there, and I'll answer or engage in conversation, if you will. Answer any questions you may have, engage in conversation, and then we'll go and we'll look at a couple of the readings. Does that make sense? Yes, Bishop.
Have you done any research around how Dr. King would go to Howard Thurman?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, we know that there are two places. Thurman actually encounters. Thurman is a contemporary of King's father, and encounters Daddy King at Morehouse and his wife. We also know the historian Lerone Bennett says that King carries a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited in his pocket. Always has that copy of the book with him, all throughout the civil rights movement. They meet once while King is at Boston, and Thurman is at Boston. They have a brief meeting. There's a story about that meeting in the autobiography. I would also guess that there are an exchange of letters between the two, but not as much one-on-one contact as we might think or might assume. Boston has a new exhibit in their Howard Gottlieb library. They've archived, there's a huge archive of Thurman's works there, donated to them by Sue Bailey. And there's a new exhibit it's really beautiful. And you can see there on the wall some of the letters, some of the back and forth between King and Thurman, as well as, other folks. Yeah. Yeah.
Expounding a little bit on the interaction of Thurman and Gandhi, how that influences Stillness, as I'm thinking about the research about Gandhi, how did that influence this notion of stillness and positive?
Well, I think, did everyone hear the question? So the relationship, Justin says, say more about the conversations that King.
Yeah. I'm curious about the conversations or even the interaction between Thurman and Gandhi and how that influenced his larger life when it came to marriage. You're talking about stillness and this notion of pausing, and how that interaction way back then may have influenced.
Yeah. Well, I'd answer it in this way. One of the points of challenge that Gandhi presents to Thurman, which I don't know how well known this is, but it's the challenge of he wants to know, how is it that Thurman can travel as a representative of American Christianity with all of its problems? And he, sort of he, as an African American male, accepting wholeheartedly a Christianity that has colonized, that has enslaved, that has resulted in so much of the brutalities that Gandhi knows about. I mean, he's aware of the problems of Christianity. Does that push Thurman? Well, I think it pushes Thurman in this sense. The first time Thurman is asked to be a part of this pilgrimage to India, he declines for this reason, because he's actually not sure if his brand of Christianity is one that they want to represent, sort of American culture. And he and Gandhi, and actually Gandhi, there's another professor there at the university that he visits. They engage in really a fruitful conversation about what it has meant for Thurman to come to a sense of his own faith in Christianity. In terms of the stillness, the aspect of stillness, I don't sense that he gets that from Gandhi. I sense that he understands his mysticism through I mentioned the Quaker mystic Rufus Jones, but they study St. Francis of Assisi. They study Spanish mystics. They study a number of folks, and even when Thurman goes to San Francisco to co-found this church, the Fellowship of All Peoples, he is intentional. He actually, with the gathering of people there, for I think it's 6 months, they study in a Bible study. They study mysticism. And it's actually programmed. It's institutionalized in their gathering, because he's wanting to get at the deeper question of what is the meaning of religious experience, and how can religious experience shape communal experience. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that brings up, I think, a real dichotomy, at least in my understanding of mysticism, because I think of mysticism as being a very personal relationship with one's God. And yet here's a man who is a mystic on the one hand, and yet he's reaching out trying to reconcile religions and races and other diversity. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Thurman's understanding, his definition of mysticism is really similar to how you understand it. I mean, it's, he says that mysticism is direct and constant exposure to God. Okay, so there you have, as you say, a very individualized experience between a person and what they understand as God. Okay, but I think again, and for me, what helps, what helps me understand this more is the notion of mysticism being mediated through particularities, through the person themselves, or the notion of mysticism arising out of particular experiences. And I think for him, what you have sort of a number of things being integrated in this person, the mystic of Howard Thurman. And one of them is a deep, The Luminous Darkness, right, is a book that is that engages the issue of race more so than any mystic I know of, But I think it's because of, and I know, my sense is that it's because of who he is. He was told, actually, when he was a student at Rochester, he had a professor, Dr. Cross, who said, Thurman, you've got a great mind, but I'd hate for you to devote all of your energies to the race question. And, for Thurman, he didn't answer that professor directly that day, but his whole life really was an answer. It was an explanation of how he couldn't not be involved in the social issue because of his, his very person called upon him to be involved. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned James Cone and being a precursor, Thurman, but not necessarily a straight line being drawn.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if it's because on Yahweh's Ruach that Cone is traveling more on word, where mysticism is traveling more on breath. Even though he comes back and folds it back into the collective, Thurman does through this reflection, and it shows up concretely.
Mm-hmm. Well, since that's interesting, Keith. Thank you. Since Luther Smith made the critique, James Cone wrote, and I forget the year that it came out, but he wrote a book on the blues. And here's where, and I'm going to play a little bit. This is not in writing anywhere. But here's where I see some similarities between Cone and Thurman. One of Thurman's books engages the spirituals, Deep River and The Negro Speaks of Life. Okay, and the way that Thurman is engaging the Negro spiritual tradition is the same way or similar way that Cone is engaging the blues tradition. So they're looking at black culture, and in looking at the experiences, the cultural experiences of black folks through music, they're both kind of arriving in similar places. Okay, they're saying, Thurman is saying, there is something about my notion of mysticism that I can actually locate in the life of the slave, of the enslaved African. There's something there. The notion of mystical experience itself, for me, is evident in the life of the slave. Now, on the other hand, Cone is saying there's something about how black people talk about the blues that, for me, says something significant about black folks' relationship with God and with other people. And so my point that I'm trying to make is that while it is true Cone does not emphasize black experience, individual black spirituality, and the like, there are places where one could, if one did their homework, one could see some resonance, some consonance between the desire to want to elevate the black religious experience or the black experience. Does that make sense? Okay. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't necessarily say one is breath, one is word. I think they're both really trying to get at, religious experience in both ways. They just go at it differently. But it's, yeah. I say more about that in the dissertation. When it comes out, you can, yeah.
So, Amy, how has Thurman's example, life and his stance, his mysticism informed your practice and your vocation and your daily life?
Okay.
Toss you a softball.
Yeah. How has it informed me? Well,
Well, yeah, that's
yeah, right. That's exactly right. It did give me a subject for dissertation. Let me answer that in two ways, because I tend to be someone who is naturally drawn to writing, memoir, journaling, meditating, prayer, sort of starting the day in ways that I feel center me. Okay, I read from Thurman many days, and I just find spiritual solace in that, in the practice itself, in reading. So that's one way of answering it. The other way I would answer your question is to say Thurman stills me in ways that I need to be stilled, because, we're often called to be activists in so many different fights. And, sort of my good sense and my desire and passion to want to do what's right really calls me to be in places where I can't be. I'm one person. And so for Thurman reminds me that allowing the deepest part of my spirit to sort of speak to an issue before I move on something is likely the best route to take. And so I pause a lot before I jump, because if I didn't do that, I would jump into everything and I'd be a crazy person. But I'm sort of reminded by him that I need to, that I would do well by just sitting still for a moment and waiting and listening. For some, that leads to to analysis. What is it? Paralysis of analysis. But for others of us, we actually need that because we would, find ourselves in too many places at once. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Do we have time to read maybe one? What are we looking at? Just one? Okay. So just one. I'm reading from Meditations of the Heart, and I'll read fast. And this is the meditation, How Good to Center Down. How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. With full intensity we seek, ere the quiet passes, a fresh sense of order in our living, a direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The question persists, what are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis, and where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where am I treasure, and what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life, and to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment. As we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note, which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. Our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round. With the peace of the eternal in our step, how good it is to center down. Thank you.